Before we begin, this episode talks about domestic violence, sexual violence, and suicide. This can be extremely triggering for some people. Listener discretion is advised. If you or someone you know needs help, in Australia, you can call the 24-hour National Domestic Family and Sexual Violence Counselling Service on 1-800-RESPECT. We have additional resources in the show notes of this episode. In Australia, on average, 1 woman a week is murdered by her current or former partner. Almost 10 women a day are hospitalised for assault injuries perpetrated by a spouse or domestic partner. There is evidence that women with disability are more likely to experience violence. Women with disabilities in Australia are around 2 times more likely than women without disabilities to experience sexual violence and intimate partner violence. My name is Susan Wood, and in this episode of Have the Nerve, I speak about the shortfalls for people with disabilities who experience or have experienced domestic, family, and sexual violence.
Yeah, so my name's Nicole Lee. I'm a survivor activist of domestic and family and sexual violence. I originally gave evidence back at the 2015 Royal Commission into Family Violence in Victoria, and that was my very much thrusted into the activism advocacy world after that with the Victim Survivors Advisory Council here in Victoria. Since then, I've started to move into the disability space with People with Disability Australia and been doing a lot of systemic frontline advocacy up in Canberra. That entails, wheeling up and down corridors and knocking on doors and harassing people. We haven't met Bob Catter yet. That's on my to-do list. And now trying to sort of make my way into the mental health space. So I'm a woman who does live with mental health conditions, mostly brought on, I believe, by trauma, but wanting, I guess, my ideal outlook with everything that I do is to connect all together, because all of these things are interlinked and intertwined, and they're treated really, really segregated and siloed. I don't think we're going to see the genuine progress that people need unless we start looking at all of these things as, interrelated.
Nicole is on the board of directors of People with Disability Australia and a passionate advocate for people with disabilities who are experiencing domestic and sexual violence. Amongst everything, we talk about coercive control, how controlling finances can play a huge part in stopping a victim from leaving, and why simply telling somebody with a disability to seek refuge isn't the answer for people with disabilities escaping violence. Yeah, because there's also, it's a huge Venn diagram between all of those things and also poverty as well. And a lot of people who are financially, tied to the situation as well.
It's huge. Poverty is a huge, correlating factor when you're looking at all of these intersecting things, whether it's mental health, DV, and the disability world. And, I have to acknowledge that, I was a mother that raised my 2 children on a disability pension. And it's a very, very bizarre position to lose my pension to go into a relationship with someone. I still live in that mindset of poverty. So my partner bought brand name Glad Wrap and I freaked out. Why are we wasting money on Glad Wrap? And he's like, it's okay, we can afford the $3.50 for the roll of Glad Wrap. It works better. And he's right, it does. But it's that whole shifting of mindset. You go into a hotel, you're taking the shampoos, conditioners and everything. The sugar.
Who isn't though? It's freely available.
Yeah. And all of those things are factors when you're looking at treatment options, when you're looking at distrust in things, and none of these systems really understand and conceptualize what the role of poverty plays in people's lives. And I know my experience in the DV sector and, engaging with child protection and things like that, and even since the work that I've done in that space and learning from that space, is that, child protection don't really fully conceptualize that intersect of poverty for people. So when you're in the unspoken written test that you don't know is happening, so things like, child protection workers looking to see whether or not a parent is changing a child's nappy often enough, but not understanding that I know I was in a position where I used to ration nappies. So unless there was a poop, that nappy, until it was ready to burst, I couldn't change it because I'd run out. And, these systems sort of judging you on your parenting, it's not because the person is a bad parent, if they just don't have the resources for anything else and they are, micromanaging all of these intersecting things. And I feel that our system isn't positioning those things enough when they're looking at a person's parenting skills and actually respecting those unspoken ways in which we find to cope and to manage, our life situation, to manage our budget. And they're not traditional ways. They're not your usual things, but, these are all the safety things we put in place. These are all the little, workarounds that we do that the system hasn't really grasped or respected, or actually looking, oh, that's actually really ingenious. It's probably not the healthiest for your baby, but these are the measures you've put in place to help yourself manage to the next paycheck. Disabled people, like most of us, live in poverty, and I think I had a bit of a come to Jesus moment when I realised I started to get a job. I was doing advocacy, and everyone around me was wearing Gorman, and I wanted to feel like I fitted in with the other women in the public service. So I went and I found it online secondhand, and I was looking for the cheapest stuff I could buy, and I felt really proud wearing these beautiful clothes with a label because I felt like I fitted in. But I forgot to actually acknowledge to everybody else in our community that actually I found this stuff cheap online. I found this stuff secondhand, and I've had to repair it, and that I didn't understand, and I do now, why I felt I needed to fit in. And this is us as disabled people wanting to fit in an able world and educate a professional able world as well, especially when, as someone with a disability, I left school at 16 and didn't return to school until I thought maybe I should go back to university in my late 30s. So I didn't even pass year 10. And now all of a sudden I'm doing a Masters of Social Work. I was told that maybe I should go and do a remedial English course, and I now have published articles. That was the expectation when I was applying for university, was asking around. I went and asked for advice on how to get into a nursing course, and they just looked at me without knowing anything about me and just said, well, I think you should go back and do an English course. All of those intersecting ableist, disempowering things just add up, and you feel like you've got no confidence. And then the world around you then puts these things on you as well and tell you you're not good enough. So I didn't honestly believe them. I went to a different university, essentially did year 12 in 16 weeks, excelled, got into my master's, and I still feel that imposter. I still feel like, oh, maybe they just gave me a good mark because they felt sorry for me because I'm disabled. It's really hard to shake that feeling, and it's something that's always going to be there in the background. And, it's kind of okay to not feel like we haven't done enough work, or to not feel that we haven't grown enough where we can see our worth. It's, some days we just, we feel really self-conscious, and we feel lack of confidence in those things. And and it's always, I think, putting out that image to people, and we all have this social media image, which is, the highlights reel. But, behind that is these people who have dealt with disempowerment, lack of confidence constantly along the way. And, some days we just feel shit. Some days we don't feel that we deserve things. And, it's hard to shake.
Nick, we've gone straight into a lot of things all of a sudden,
Sorry.
all at once. No, I love it. And there's so many things about what you've just said that I want to talk about. But for people who actually don't know who you are, despite the dozens of articles and your actual quite well-formed career, do you mind giving us a little bit of background just about yourself, whatever you feel comfortable with mentioning?
Yeah, well, I am a mother of two children and now a grandchild as well. So I became a parent at 18, very young. My earlier years as a teenager, I was desperate to be a musician. Didn't get into the VCA because I didn't have the maths or English or skills around those sorts of things. I just wasn't interested, so I just didn't care. And I thought that I was incompetent because I couldn't read, I couldn't spell, so I never bothered with English. Since found I love reading, I love writing. So I went and I worked for quite a fair while, got pregnant quite young, had a first marriage, which unfortunately didn't last very long. Went into a second marriage not long after that was the one that became quite violent there for a while. for a long time, for 10 years. It's a hard thing for me to talk about, I guess, talking about violence, because I've done it so much. So that background is that, I lived through 10 years of violence with my ex-husband, and it did encompass, all of those financial abuse, physical, that coercion, control, which is the new word that we're using now around power and control. It's essentially, it's psychological abuse, and it makes you doubt the world around you, and sexual violence as well. And that came to a grinding halt all of a sudden. So it came a point I had made a few, so content warning here for some people as well. I'd made a few suicide attempts over the years because I just didn't know how to live with what I was living with. And I made one final attempt and, confessed to the emergency department what was happening. And that's where, the child protection intersect in my life became involved, and police became involved. He was eventually arrested. It was really, really hard to engage with these systems and trust these systems, which has been a big part of my work around understanding the criminal justice system for disabled people and why we run from it. And so he ended up spending about 2.5 years in prison. He was found guilty. From there, it's been this kind of whirlwind journey of different opportunities to speak at different things, work on research project, the process of rebuilding myself, rebuilding my family, building a career, which, I never thought I had. I'm someone that, during those 10 years and even before that was going to my local craft groups alongside my mum and doing sewing and china painting and all sorts of random mummy things.
Not that those aren't great. They can be heaps of fun.
Oh, I enjoyed them. Like all of us, very complex person with different intersecting things in my life. And it's been bizarre since leaving violence, the people I've met. So I'm really good friends with Rosie Batty. We sat on a council together. Her and I did not like each other to start with. We've both got a lot of trauma. We were both thrown into this new whirlwind. Let's work with this, victim survivors, which nobody else had done anywhere in the world. We butted heads a few times because we were both very convicted to our, positions. But now we're really good friends. We're actually really firm friends, which is interesting. And one of the other people, I guess, that has influenced me along the way, look him up, is Phil Cleary, who was another one of the Victim Survivors Advisory Council members. So for over 30 years now, been in the activism space after losing his sister to men's violence. So she was murdered by her ex-former partner, who was found not guilty of defensible homicide based on provocation. So he is one of the early people in the 90s who brought down that law eventually in 2002. So he's a bit of one of our giants in this space. So I've learned a lot from him. And I always tell people, to begin with, he's very passionate, very loud when, in the room, and he's giving them all the problems. So to start with, I was a bit scared of him, and now I can call him up and have a chin wag for an hour. I also did Paralympic swimming and sports for a little while there. I was a wheelchair tennis player where I met my ex-husband. And we played tennis together, and we travelled around with our kids, again, on the poverty line. So cup noodles, hostels, traveling around, taking our children to different tournaments and playing, and then driving back. And then I moved on to Paralympic swimming for a very long time. And unfortunately, I had another injury during that time where I had a C5-6, which I don't talk about, fusion in my neck, which took me out of swimming. So I ended up with more nerve damage in my arms, so further spinal damage. Yeah, so that I forget that was a really big part of my coping. Yeah, and that was a huge part of my life, huge part of coping with the violence I was dealing with, a huge part of managing my mental health was sport. And I think that's also another thing we don't chat about enough is, all of the untraditional ways of coping with what we're living with as disabled people.
We are talking about you, but it is actually not all about you. Like your story is probably one of hundreds of thousands of people out there who have a very similar path to you. And one of the things that, you mentioned earlier which I'm very fascinated by, is the progressively serious nature people are taking coercive control. Even up until 5 years ago, if not even shorter than that, coercive control was not really something that people spoke about as something that is serious. Do you perhaps want to talk about why it's so important that people take that seriously?
Well, it's really understanding the level of control and manipulation that a partner sort of slowly, you become the frog in the pot of water that starts to boil. And it's this breaking down of your ability to see reality or your terms of reality. So they start undermining what you're saying, what they're doing, what you're seeing. And we did have before what was called the power and control, the Duluth power and control wheel. And I guess we use slightly different language, which was power and control. So it's that cycle of violence. So it's, you're going through your nice little honeymoon phase, everything's great, they're attentive, they're loving, and then all of a sudden you start to walk on these eggshells, and things are not great and you're doing things wrong. So you're tiptoeing along the eggshells with your partner. And then, it could be anything innocuous that you do wrong, which tips them over the edge, and you're in an argument, there's violence, and then you're in that fight and flight mode as a victim. And you start to, you're protecting yourself, you're really worried, you're scared, you're trying to run, you want to leave. And then oh, I'm so sorry, the apologizing, the nice side of them comes out, and I'll get help, and all of these promises. And you're like, okay, we're really forgiving people. I'll give them another chance. And then you want to hold on to this nice part of them so desperately in the hope that they're going to change. But the thing is, and this is why it's called the power and control wheel, is because it goes in this cycle. And I know for me, that was a really aha moment, was actually seeing that on a piece of paper, the Duluth power and control wheel, and going, oh my God, that's what I've been living with for years. And this is a way to keep you stuck and to keep you trapped. And they apologize. Then you start going back into that little honeymoon phase, and then the eggshells start again. And it's little things. So I remember not being able to wear skirts and dresses because really horrible things like, oh, that's easy access, you're going to cheat on me. I think back to it now, and now I wear skirts and dresses all the time. But it's those little things, and it's like, oh, but I'm not doing that. It's not the case. And they make you actually believe that you've done something wrong, and then this is just some horrible thing that other women don't do. And they start to position the way they're behaving towards you or the violence that you're encountering as being your fault. And that's where that coercion comes in. Being coerced into acts of intimacy and sex. Well, it's not intimacy with them based on, well, men have needs and you don't, and this is just something you do as a wife, and if you just did this and that, and if you were more sexual, you were more these things, then I wouldn't have to do this to you. So then that coercion comes in for blaming you for sexual violence, blaming you for why they had to behave that way. And it's really insidious because it's hard to pinpoint. It's hard to identify as a victim. And it's really good that we're actually talking about this now. Some of the ways in which we want to handle it, I'm not comfortable with yet at this point in time, because I think for us as a community, that criminalizing it and putting it purely in that criminal justice space, I think is dangerous because there's a lot of us who don't feel safe in that space. There's other ways of talking about what this looks like for our community. So I remember things like, and I was just talking the other day around, this goes into that financial abuse space. So it's not just a matter of somebody controlling all of your finance. For us, it's around positioning it as their role of caring for you, not allowing you to build capacity. So saying, you're not smart enough to use a computer, so therefore I need to do it for you. And you better not touch it because they're really expensive. The intersect of poverty, you might break it. So I better do all this for you. So, not only are they taking control of it, they're also making you actively scared of using it. And they're not allowing you to build any capacity to use any of the technology that we take for granted. So for me, that was we met back in end of 2003, 2004, was removed in 2014. A lot of technology was built in that time. I had no idea how to engage with it or use it. The stuff we take for granted every day, a lot of us are being denied being able to, like that capacity building, which is one of the core things of NDIS, capacity building. That's power and control. That's coercive control. Telling somebody that you're not capable, that's controlling someone, and that's a way to keep that person reliant on you. For us as disabled people, it's a way for you to be retained as being reliant on that, that formal, informal carer support role, whether it's a parent, paid, sibling, partner. That's coercive control for us, and that's something that unfortunately can be really, really visible too, because the external world can be seeing this and watching this and just thinking, oh, that's just their role of caring. And in this discussion around coercive control, we need to have a more broader discussion around it, or what this looks like for other communities, diverse communities, the trans community, around withholding, hormone medication, or for us, withholding capacity building, withholding assistive technology, all of those things. And, that is part of the conversation that we need to broaden for us as a community, and define what it is for us as a community as well, across the broad spectrum of the different ways in which disability affects us, and the way in which coercive and control can intersect with those, varying degrees of disability and diversity.
At the time for you, not just that, you have a disability, but your abuser was also your primary carer. You did mention that you had attempted suicide multiple times. So what were you doing, or had you tried to tell people about the issues? And then could you talk about like the action or inaction that was being taken on your behalf?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was desperately engaging with the mental health system because of that, coercion and and that manipulation of your mind, is that you're the one with the problem. You're the one that needs to fix yourself. You're the crazy person. So I engaged with psychiatrists. I was engaging with the mental health system over and over and over, thinking I need to fix me, and then our relationship will be fine. I'm the one with the problem. And then going into that system and then being, pathologized, and none of the people in that system really positioned, well, what is this woman's environmental health? What is going on at home? Because something is not right here. And he was just viewed as being the carer who was standing by this woman who was slowly losing her mind, and still supporting her when he was the cause of that mental health. There was never an opportunity, apart from my private psychiatrist, that would, look at that, mention that, and say that. And I remember disclosing this to so many different services along the way. I used to tell my psychiatrist, and he was the thing that kept me going through a lot of this. And there's not too many psychiatrists like him out there, I must admit. And he did say, Nick, this is more an issue of your environmental health, not your mental health. And I would tell him, look, this happened again last night. And I'd cry with him, and he would just sit there and say to me, this is not okay. This is abuse. This is rape. Do you want to see someone? And I was so scared of the system that I couldn't go to the police. But he would sit with me in that. And there was also nothing he could do due to client and patient confidentiality. But he did sit with me in it, and he never wavered on that, you don't need to live like this line. But other systems, I call these systems gaslighting, which I'm sure a lot of us have heard along the way, in our lives, or experiences in our lives, is, telling systems and them prefacing the carer voice beside me. So I'm saying, I would say things like, because I also had anorexia really, really badly, and refusing to eat as a way to cope with the environment. And, saying to these people, he will not call an ambulance if I pass out. He will not call them while I've got a heartbeat. This is what he has threatened to me. Oh, no, we don't believe that. He's there with you. He will do something. He cares. And they didn't believe me. They didn't want to believe me. And they kept sending me home to him to be put in danger.
And then do they speak to him? And then obviously he just reconfirms things that they...
Yep. Yeah. So, rather than... and coming to me and asking me stuff, or even in a meeting together, rather than, talking to me on my own, which is the safest option, or when they did talk to me on my own, they didn't believe me, but then they'd bring him into the room as well, and he'd undermine everything I said. So if you ask a perpetrator what's going on for that person over there mentally, they're going to tell that service what they want them to hear, not what is actually happening. And I had disclosed to a lot of people what was going on. And this is where the system gaslighting comes into it. And you're telling them stuff, you're telling them some pretty heavy violence going on, and abuse and belittling. And when they don't take action, you start to, again, doubt yourself as you had with them. Maybe he's right. Maybe I'm overreacting. Maybe this isn't as bad as I thought it was. Maybe I just need to deal with it. Maybe I just need to get better. And it plays into their violence too, and it plays into that coercive control, and that the system then gaslights you too. The system then is using those same tactics that they do. And then you do become just broken and hopeless, because I've reached out to everyone possible. They don't seem to be worried, so it can't be that bad.
Can I ask, do you think that the lack of serious nature that they took your issues to be, do you reckon the disability had anything to do with that? Like they were like, yeah, okay.
Yeah, because, going in there in a wheelchair, and needing higher support care needs, is that, he was, because there was that visual reminder of carer as well, rather than just, a mental health carer. He was my support on multiple levels, that did play a major role in that as well, that they, mental health aside, he's always going to be the carer. He was, a disabled person himself, but, was only missing, he was a leg amputee, so much less disabled. He took over the role of looking after the children and taking them to school because I was in hospital. So he was constantly put on this pedestal as this carer.
Oh, interesting. There was a Q&A episode this year where you wrote an article about a report called The Choice, Violence and Poverty. And it stated that 45% of single mothers had a disability or a long-term health condition. But there was no insight, no deep dive investigation into what sort of disabilities they had, how they acquired their disability, and this kind of feeds into what you were saying earlier about, how people either didn't believe you or might have not thought that what you were saying was true, or might not have been, I don't, look, please correct me if I'm wrong, but let's just say, for example, they're going to take action, you need support.
Yep.
And that support is just not reflected in the investigation. I mean, this could mean that people with disabilities, wherever they are, who are trapped in this situation, literally cannot, because just like you say, there's no realistic support for them. I think you were saying in an article that they offered to take you to a women's shelter, but what does that mean? That's just so much more than what they think it's going to be.
And saying, I'm going to take you to a women's shelter, and it might have a ramp, it might be physically accessible, but unless you have the resources to access supports to help you get to stay in, and continue to remain there, then how do we go? How do we get there? If you can't access support workers, if you don't have NDIS, or you have a very limited NDIS package, which again is another form of abuse to help someone stay reliant on you, is to deny you having support. So you could have a very limited funding package. So unless you have access to resources that help you go to and stay and continue to stay safely in that environment, then it's just not possible. And other things, like, nobody mentioned to me when they said, oh, would you like to go to a refuge? Well, my kids are at home with him. What do I do? No one said we can go and pick up your kids. Nobody said that we can help you to continue to look after your kids, that you can stay in this refuge, and we'll continue to support you in your role as mother as well. So there's all of these factors. And then again, that poverty issue too, living on a pension and being in debt, and, not understanding that fear of losing your children to the system, losing your children to the, quote unquote, better parent, less disabled parent, the less clinically documented as mentally unwell parent, but not positioning that the violence is the cause of that, mentally unwell position. We're all of these factors. It's more than just a refuge. It's more than just an accessible refuge. It's this wraparound supports of somebody with a disability to be able to do those things, and understanding that this disabled person has probably never accessed online banking, probably has never accessed their own bank, wouldn't know how to pay a bill. All of those things are things that we need support with, are things that we need wrapped around us to help very quickly and in a crisis whilst you're dealing with trauma and courts and police, is like this, hard and fast capacity building that has to happen then and there. Otherwise, this person is again in lots of other, dangerous situations, from, financial debt as well, or, you're not financially safe because this person has control of all of that. So it's very complex, and I know in Victoria we're doing a lot of work to try and provide those wraparound services, but there's just not enough. And I think there's, in that report around, lots of disabled mothers with disabilities, I think it's been underestimated how many of us are out there, how many of us are choosing, and it is choosing the choice. And I did for a long time, staying in that relationship because I didn't know what else was out there. I didn't know what was available. And we don't do enough educating within the community of what initiatives are out there, what things are being developed, what things you can access in an emergency and in a crisis, how the system kicks into action. And whilst it might be limited, there are things there. And if you don't know they're there, you just don't know they're there.
I know.
You need to know what's available to calculate what your risk is and to calculate whether or not you can leave. And then the other side of that is when you do engage with a service or a system or you make a phone call, what help do you need? If you don't know what they can provide, it's a very loaded question. And I've said that to so many, how many social workers, like, and what can I help you with today? And it's like, what I actually need you to say is, these are the things we offer. These are the services we can provide. What is it you need? And it's like pushing that system to take a proactive response versus that kind of reactive response, like, oh, what can we help you with? Like, this is what we can do. What is it you need? And what do you think is the most important thing for you to do right now? And let me just explain to you, these are some of the risks as well that you're currently sitting in. No one explained any of the risks that I was living with. Or some of the risks that I was trying to navigate. And I did put myself in a few dangerous positions and a few really, really high risk positions, and I didn't even know. But if somebody had that conversation around, these are the things we need to be doing to keep you safe, these are the risks that you're currently living with, and this is how we can help you manage those risks. So you don't know what your risk is if nobody sits there and goes through it with you. And that's a failure of the system for us as a community.
You're in a position where you've literally just left and you don't know what it is that you want. Nobody knows what they want when they've left a situation like that. What are some of the risks that people could fall into, that they just from a lack of information or a lack of their social worker knowing what they need? What are some of the risks that can occur?
Well, things like knowing who has control over your bank account. Does this person have power of attorney over being able to access it, empty it, close it, all of those things? So finding out who has power of attorney of your bank account. Do you have access to it, or does somebody else have access to it? And then finding someone that can then take over that access that is trusted is a huge risk. So that financial risk, and then there was things like, nobody explained to me that the most dangerous time when leaving somebody is in the point of separation. That's when you're at most risk of being murdered. So here I was meeting him to drop over the kids or to hand over the kids or allowing contact and stuff, because I thought that's what I needed to do to keep him calm. I thought I needed to keep reassuring him that things are fine, the kids and I are fine, you just get some help, we'll come out of this stronger, because I knew deep down instinctively, I need to keep this person calm because that'll help keep me safe. But I didn't realize that by doing that, I was putting myself in a dangerous situation. I was putting myself, in contact with him with no other people around, where, domestic homicide does happen.
This year, an article released by Australia's National Research Organisation for Women's Safety Limited said that according to the Australian Institute of Criminology, intimate partner homicide is the most common form of homicide in Australia. These offences accounted for 21% of all homicides in Australia in 2018 to 2019 and 62% of all domestic homicides.
And I did not know that that was a thing until, the work that I started doing, that now I know that. But, when you first separate, you're in the highest risk of being murdered, and you're and your children as well. And no one told me that. That, when I think back to it, is some of the stuff that I struggle to sit with now. And I worry for all of the other people out there that are leaving, who are still very confused, who are still feeling like, oh, maybe I need to give them another chance. Maybe that was too harsh. No, actually, it's fine to be harsh. It's okay. It'll hit you later. But to start with, you're doubting the choices that you've made, and you're reaching out the olive branch, but the olive branch actually puts you in danger, and you're reaching out that olive branch because of the doubts they've built in you. The toughest thing was to really eventually to make that no contact, to cut that down, to say, look, I'm not going to make contact with you anymore. This is the way it's going to be. And that was really hard because I cried and I agonized. That guilt I'd been made to feel, that I needed this person. Oh, well, he did stick through me through all of these bad things, and I at that point couldn't see that he was the cause of those things. So that guilt, that fear of, but what if I lose my children? What if I lose my house? What if I end up in a nursing home? So all of those fears were valid and real, but I just had to sit through and trust that I could do it on my own. So I'd been made to believe that I wasn't capable, and I had to let him go to realise that I was. And then to go to those services, hey, look, I'm not coping with this. What can you do to help me? I don't know what else to do. I need help with a shower. I need help with opening my back door. And they're like, oh, we've got this funding. And it was, and it was all of those things of just being vulnerable to people and saying, look, I need help. I don't know what to do. These are the things he did for me. And it was when somebody showed me that there was another way to live, that I didn't need to rely on this person, that I did have the right and I did deserve to have somebody else in my life, that there were other ways to receive support, that it didn't necessarily have to come from him. So I believed that it all had to come from him, that there was no one else that could help me. And until somebody stepped in and said, oh, we can get a support worker in, we can get this equipment for you, we can do all of these things, we can put these structures and systems in place, that I went, oh, I don't need him. Oh, maybe I don't want him. And that's the aha moment was, oh, I needed you to survive. Now that I don't need you to survive, the system stepped in, other services became involved, and I was given that, from a disability perspective, the supports that I needed to live independently, even though they were supports, but they were independent of him. But it took so long to get there. And this is where I believe we need a system that is proactive in putting those things in place, so that people can realise, what it is that they want sooner and on their own terms, is something that we need to be doing, that I don't see happening enough. We're waiting for people to say, hey, I need help, versus saying, this is what we can do. We're going to get this in place, and we're going to take off your reliance from this person. And then once we get you safe from a disability support perspective, do you still want this person? Do you still love this person? And there were elements, and I guess, and that's a hard thing to realize, there is love there, and that takes a while to disconnect from. But, giving people that space to go, no, I don't want to live like this. No, we weren't happy. And no, this wasn't a healthy relationship. And I've got these support needs met now. And I remember saying that to him, you go and fix you. You go get some counselling. And in a year's time, maybe we can rekindle this. Maybe if you sort yourself out. So I flipped it. So from me needing help and support, I flipped it back onto him and realised none of this was my fault. He didn't want to get support. He didn't want to change. He could never see what he was doing was wrong. I waited a very long time to make a report to the police, and that's when I made the report to the police, when I said, I need to come in and make that report. He refuses to get help. He's never going to change. I finally saw he was never going to get change. I finally saw that he was blaming me for everything, and it wasn't my fault. As women, we want to help and save our partners. We want to help and save the people around us. I can't save this person. It's his job. And I need to keep myself safe and my children safe. And that's when he was charged and convicted. But it took a long journey. And I remember the police officer saying to me, unlike other women I've worked with, it took me a much longer time working with you. I had to work much slower. I had to just wait until you were ready, and I didn't think you would ever be ready. And I would not be alone in that. That would be something that I think a lot of disabled people would be going through. And I would like to see police officers that know how to work with that, know how to navigate that, just slowly making contact, keeping in contact with the person, gauging where they're at, and eventually, if that person wants to walk down that path, then walking down that path with them, but also understanding why they may not want to. We've had a system that's taken over for us. We've had a system that's jumped in and told us what we need to do versus just having someone that just worked slowly and understood why I couldn't and why I was reluctant. I was very lucky. I had a detective unit that I worked through that had a complex understanding of domestic and family violence, but then also somebody that realised, oh, hang on, this woman with a disability is going to be much harder to work with. And she took the time and she took the patience. I could have had a detective that didn't, and it would have been a very, very different story.
So when you go from 2003, 2004 to 2014, how did you absorb all the updated technology?
Oh, that was a long journey, and it still is a long journey.
People might not really understand, like even smartphones going from 2003, 2004 to now, even 2014. Huge. Social media exploded. Like everything exploded. So how did you absorb that?
It was a very steep learning curve, but lots of calling different things. So I'd only just I had a smartphone, which was my first introduction to a computer, which would have been maybe 2011, 2012. I'd never owned a computer. So my first introduction to the computer and the internet was via a smartphone. Plenty of hours sitting on my bedroom floor crying, calling, eventually Apple were really great. Eventually getting someone on the phone just saying, I don't know what to do. Just jump online and do blah, blah, blah. I'm like, but I don't know how to do that. I don't know what you mean. What do you mean a website? What are you talking about? So sitting there with them, working my way through how to change passcodes on things, how to access my emails properly, how to change the passcodes on those, how to pay a phone bill, how to pay an electricity bill. I used to go to the post office and do that stuff. So all of a sudden, if you just jump online and do X, Y, Z, I don't know how. And people just sort of a bit miffed or confused. Well, what do you mean you don't know how? Well, I've never used a computer. I don't know what I've heard of websites. I've heard of all of this stuff, but I don't know what they look like. Looking at things like Facebook. I'd used Instagram a little bit, but how to do safety stuff, how to make it private, how to make it safe. Just sitting there working through that stuff, asking friends and things, navigating websites. Only recently, the last 2 years, I think, that I started self-managing my NDIS. So when the NDIS came in, I did not want to use the MyGov portal. I had never used the MyGov portal. I was terrified of it. I thought it was confusing. So I had plan management for a very long time because I just did not want to touch it.
Yeah, that's fine. You have to do what you have to do.
Yeah, and that's the thing. And my supports around me just saying, it's okay, we'll help you walk through it. And it took a long time to trust them around, okay, maybe I need to do this. I still find the portal really confusing and scary. It's funny, I talk about, trauma triggers, and one of my major trauma triggers is the online world. So when people say jump online and have a look at this or upload this or work on that, and I find it really, really embarrassing as well because I get I fall straight now in 2022 back into that space on my bedroom floor in 2014 where I'm crying and I'm yelling at the other person on the end of the phone, but you don't get it. I don't know what to do. It's not going to work. I can't find the button. I don't know what you're talking about. I fall directly back into that space, and that's what trauma does. It puts you back into that event which was traumatic, and having to work that stuff out was traumatic, on top of the violence as well. And so that has left a trigger. So, navigating the university students online, I still hate it. I still struggle with it. I have a partner that is a programmer, so understands computers, and he keeps reassuring me, I don't know why you think these things should work. And they don't work for everyone, but reassuring me that the online world is confusing and it's not just you. Just the other day, realizing NDIS had overpaid me, and I cried and I yelled and I just went into this complete meltdown, mental meltdown mess. And that's how many years on now? 8 years on now. I'm still in that space of. I had to work out how to process a refund to the NDIS, and I just couldn't do it.
I don't know how to process a refund to the NDIS. I don't know.
I've never had to do it before. But rather than just like being confused, I was just this absolute emotional breakdown. Yeah.
I guess when you're trying to go to as many people as possible for information because you've just left this shell. I mean, it's basically somebody has just put you in their shell, away from literally everything, and you're coming out of it. Technology is becoming very apparent that it's something that needs to be trained immediately for people who might have been not had access or and then it's a very good point that you bring up earlier about not having the self-esteem or confidence to be able to think, I'm just going to give it a go. I'm just going to press this button and just see what happens. Yes. Because part of it is also because of what you said earlier when your ex-husband would say, you don't need to. You don't need to do this. You don't need to do X. I'll look after it for you, which is huge. And people don't really understand that also goes on to everything. I guess at the same time, you're always healing. You're always in a healing process. Would that be right?
Yeah. So and it's that thing where I've had other people contact me, and that's made me realize that you can't put the triumph over adversity story out there. Where I've had other survivors and it hit me and they said, I wish I could be as recovered as you. I'm like, oh my goodness, I'm not as recovered as you think I am. You've seen the glossy highlights reel of me, but me the other day crying at my partner going, but it's not going to work. Melting down over something as little as, I had to press the button and I was scared. Exactly. I was scared to press that button because all of those thoughts of you're going to break it. You don't know what you're doing. You're going to break it. This technology is expensive. You're not capable. All of that horrible language that we hate in our community around, you're too stupid. You're too dumb. You're not intelligent. All of those ableist slurs that, we really take deeply on board were things that were said to me. So all of those things are coming back into my head. And then I had guilt around, I should be able to cope with this. But you know what? Recovery is that very slow journey. And I don't know any other way to describe it other than a journey, is that we do, there's things that get better, there's things that you improve on, and there's things that you rebuild yourself with. But that takes, and I don't think I will ever stop it. I'll be on that my whole entire life. But that has also taken a partner that is very understanding, that is non-reactive, that just sits with me in those situations, that doesn't try and fix me, doesn't try and tell me that I need to do X, Y, and Z, need to calm down, or but will just sit with me in that moment and doesn't react back at me. That is calm, empathetic, and takes the time to just be there in that moment with me. And then comes a lot of that shame, like, I'm so sorry, I really wish I was better. And I do. I sit with a lot of guilt. I sit with a lot of shame around, I shouldn't yell at you like that. I shouldn't be yelling at all like that. I should be able to cope with these things. And then for survivors, we're dealing with trauma, plus we're dealing with feelings of being inadequate, with not being recovered enough. And I think especially with the pandemic in the last couple of years, is that I realized that I spent a long time keeping myself busy to run away from my trauma. And I think what I did was that I used my trauma in the space and I ran with it to run away from it. But it distracted, which distraction is a really key safety coping mechanism which a lot of us use, which I think is a really, really brilliant strategy. But when there was no distraction, when the pandemic took all of that away, when we got locked down in Melbourne and I just had to sit there with it, I fell apart. The last couple of years has been really messy. And to every survivor out there that fell apart during this time, you're not alone. I did it. I know friends that did. I've got plenty of friends that just did not cope, having to sit with the memories, the trauma, the what do I do now? Because we kept ourselves busy. We grabbed our trauma and we ran to it to run away from it. Counterproductive. It worked, but it didn't solve anything. So trying to make peace with that has been very, very hard, and I'm still trying to make peace with it. But it's been difficult. Like, my mental health has really struggled the last couple of years from a trauma perspective. And I don't think that I'm wrong. I don't think that I'm inadequate, but it's the reality of what it is. And it's the reality of the world we're living in now, and the new space that we find ourselves in. And I'm trying very desperately to not fall back into that. Keep yourself too busy so you never have to think about it. Keep moving so you don't have to sit still with it. A lot of grief as well for my children. So I grieve a lot for my kids. And I don't talk about them very much because that's their private lives. But, they have their trauma. They have their things they struggle with. And as a parent, having to live with, manage, deal with your own trauma, deal with your own mental health and emotions and fallout from everything over the years, having to then carry your children through all of that, it's a tough gig. It's very hard. But I have a lot of grief around, but, if I had a healthy, happy family, if I'd had my children in this family, if they'd, lived an existence of support and love and care and no violence, who could they be? And I grieve for the loss of what my children could have had, the future that they could have had, the future that didn't involve nightmares, the future that didn't involve fears. So I grieve for that, and that's a really hard thing. And I do and all I can do now is be there for them, support them with everything, and be the best parent I can be, and for myself to be here, so to keep myself alive through all of this as well. But grieving the loss for who they could have been, grieving the loss for that, that little child that was so bold and outgoing and vivacious and that had the whole world ahead of them. That used to tell me these wild stories like the Medicare ad, this monster came and bit me in half, and my legs went that way and my head went that way, to this, lovely but recluse child. So this lovely child of mine that, is timid, that is scared, that is quiet. And I just think, who could you have been? And so I grieve for the loss of the future that they could have had, knowing that it has changed. But that doesn't mean that it's forever damaged. That doesn't mean it's forever gone. It's just changed. And there's that grief for that. And that's been something I've had to sit with a bit more lately. And then trying not to overcompensate for it too.
It's a lot of things you got to think about.
Yeah, and nobody gives you a guidebook on this. There is no how-to guide, because we all have our different things at different points. We all have our different things that we struggle with more than others. And it's having a network of people around you and other survivors around you where you can just bounce things off each other. So I have a good friend that I do bounce things off. A friend in Queensland that has been a lot of my saving grace. So we bounce all of these ideas off each other, why we struggle with certain things, the worries we have for our children, the grief we have with our parenting, that a lot of our parenting was taken away, a lot of our mothering was damaged and taken away, and grieving for that. understanding why we're struggling with our health now, why we're struggling with our mental health now, and just having that validated, knowing I'm not alone. So that shared experience, I think, is something that is really vital for survivors, to find their people, find their trusted people that they can go to and just say, oh, today was a shit day and these are the things I'm feeling, and have that person go, yeah, I understand it. I felt them too. These were some of the things that helped. Or just even validating when somebody tells you what you're feeling is wrong, just going, oh, other people just don't get it. And knowing that this person does. Those things are really vital for survivors. Those, especially for people with disabilities, especially for people that sit outside, I guess, the norm. It's finding those connections and finding that community of trusted people that you can go to.
When you started talking about your story at the 2015 Victorian Royal Commission, you stated that that was actually a pivotal moment for you and sharing your story. I guess then, since then, you've done quite a lot of work, and, we're here talking about you. But again, this is about you, but it's not about you. But what things do you think we need to start implementing now on a national level that you've discovered through your work, people sharing their stories with you, especially for people who are in situations where they physically cannot leave?
Well, I think just from the telling the story perspective is finding ways in which to give victim survivors validation. So we don't necessarily all want to speak to the media. We don't necessarily all want to write a book or tell our story in that way. But finding, but a lot of us do, and a lot of us do want to, tell our story. We do want the world to know what we've been through. We do want that validation. We want to be seen and heard. And I've heard that, and that's been in a lot of reports, is that victim survivors, need to feel seen, they need to feel heard, and they need to feel validated. So finding different alternative ways rather than purely just the media in which to give victims that validation, have that way of being heard, have that way of being seen. So I'm a big believer. We've got victims of crime compensation, which is still just a court process, so I'm not a big fan of it. I've been through it, wasn't fun. But having a truth-telling tribunal where you can go to a panel of your peers, you can go to a panel of your experts, and you can just tell your story, you can tell your truth. Have these people, these peers, these experts just sit there and validate that what you've been through, is violence and that you deserved better. To sitting with you in that, so listening to you, believing you, validating what you've been through, and then sitting there with you, well, what is it that you as an individual need to recover? Would you like, recovery can look like many different things. So it's not necessarily traditional counselling methods. It could be, would you like to be matched up with maybe a peer mentor? Would you like to get into the advocacy space? Would you like to just have weekly massages done and with someone that understands trauma, that works slowly on touch? What is it that recovery looks like for you? Is it, say, I know things for me were things like getting rid of my dinner set, and one that he hadn't bought, one that didn't remind me of him, one that didn't remind me of all of the trauma around, just eat and all that food stuff. So going to the op shop and buying a new dinner set. What are those things that look like for you? So to be seen, heard, believed, what does recovery look like for you as an individual outside of those traditional things like, oh, we'll just fund some counselling sessions and that'll do it. But, it's more than counselling. There's so many more things in counselling. Is it, do you need completely new sheets and clothes? Do you need to get rid of everything that reminds you of him? Well, how do we go about that? Do we need to hire a personal organiser because, you're living in chaos and your house is a mess? Do you need help to just clean up your space so you feel like this is a fresh space? What is it you need? And I think for that, storytelling piece of it, that's a huge part of it that we're not looking at is, what does that truth-telling look like? How can that look like for victim survivors? We need to have alternative pathways of how to reach the system, as many ways to reach the system as possible. So making sure, every family violence service, that's my dog, you can hear his ears flipping, every family violence service is accessible for all of us. So we don't want, as Stella Young said, special is another form of shit. Every family violence service should be accessible to us. One of the things we do have in Victoria is the Disability Family Violence funding package, which gives you access to financial resources around, what is it you need to leave? What is it you need to keep safe? That gives you access to support services and things. So, we need the NDIS to take this up. We need the federal government to roll this out federally, nationally. So for every single state to have this pool of funding which supports this person that supports you from that disability perspective. So the family violence service to wrap around you from a risk perspective, but also the disability sector to wrap around us from a disability perspective of how to live independently. And we need funding, dedicated funding for people trying to escape violence. We need multiple ways to communicate with the community. So one of the things that came out of the pandemic, Safe Steps, one of the boards that I sit on, we developed a web chat. So that opened up the world for people who are deaf and hard of hearing. We need to invest in community outreach for people with disability. And so for a lot of us, we are stuck in our homes, and how do we go about that? I think the NDIS has a huge role of overseeing. We see them every year, every 2 years for our plan reviews. I think there's a huge missing part here around the NDIS taking the time to sit with the person on their own, so asking supports to leave the room. So something I've been saying for a long time. Ask the supports to leave the room. Have a one-to-one. Do a small risk assessment with this person. Does anybody make you feel unsafe at home? Does anybody make you feel unhappy at home? So safety for us is, are you a falls risk? So does anybody make you scared at home? So using that real language that speaks better to us rather than, are you a safety concern? No. Are you scared? Does anybody make you feel scared? Looking for red flags of abuse, and then having, like a plan of, if there's something identified there, well, then how do we slowly work with this person to identify it for themselves? How do we put some key services in place that might have some oversight, that might be able to do that capacity building very gently and carefully in a very safe manner? Is that we look at participants of the NDIS as a risk to the system via financial risk. Have we ever been done for fraud? All that kind of stuff. But we're not looking at whether or not our participants in the NDIS are at risk from abuse in those planning sessions. So I think there's a real failure there to grasp those moments, to have a really quick one-on-one chat with that person on their own, which also allows to help us feel seen and heard. So a lot of the time, I'd go into things together, and everybody would talk to him. So having that one-on-one with a person, so those moments of feeling seen and heard, and valued, even if it may not have been wanting to leave, I at least felt like a person for that little brief moment. Those things are important to us, and people underestimate that. And the other thing is, and this is the thing with the coercive control debate, is that huge conversation around, we need to criminalise it. But we need other accesses and understanding of what justice looks like for us. And it may not be in that criminal justice space. If we keep saying that victim survivors need justice, and this is the only justice that we've got, that is the only justice we're going to seek. But looking at, what does justice look like for us? A huge piece and body of work that needs to be done on that. What does justice look like for us? What does a justice pathway look like? And having multiple ways of gaining justice versus just this one over here, which for a lot of us is really dangerous. A lot of us, the criminal justice system at this point in time is not safe for our community. People with mental health conditions and having their mental health records subpoenaed into a court is most definitely not safe. I've had that done. It's incredibly damaging. How do we stop that how do we mitigate the harm done in that criminal justice system for our community and for anyone really? But then offering alternatives, offering pathways to other areas, or pathways that are alternatives where we might go, yeah, this works for me, or the pathway that then leads on to the next step to heading towards that criminal justice system. These are things that I feel need to be done for us as disabled people and for other diverse communities. There's more than one way to gain justice. And I've had this so-called traditional justice. He went to jail. it does not feel like justice. It was very, very damaging to gain that justice. I don't fully believe that the impact outweighed the benefit. Hearing everybody say, but we want justice, but I'm telling you right now, this is not the justice that I needed. Being heard, being seen, being believed, and then developing what does justice look like for us and how can that be without those traditional patriarchal structures of justice. Thinking outside that box is huge, and we always are the afterthought. We need ours that is for us, by us, and done, in conjunction with us. So that whole nothing about us without us, like this is that. And it's usually driven by able-bodied. It's usually driven by politics. It's usually driven by systems who are so beholden to their way of doing things that it's very hard to see any of those things actually working for us.
Nicole, this has been such an insightful conversation. Is there any final thoughts you want to tell people? If I don't want to say advice, but is there something you want to leave our audience with?
That I'm going to keep doing this work for until I can't. Like, I get exhausted, our bodies wear out, but this is something that no matter how hard it gets some days, that I'm going to keep doing this. I'm going to keep flying to Canberra and pushing them to meet with us, to understand our position, to listen to us. I'm just one person. You need to bring in other people. You need to be listening to all of us, that we are a diverse community, that we have different needs. It is not a one-size-fits-all when it comes to supporting us from multiple range of issues. And to keep pushing to have as many of our voices at the table as possible from multiple different directions and diversities, that there's still such a lack out there. And that I hope as many of you take something away from this that resonate in the face of feeling deflated. We'll keep pushing, because progress is slow, is one of the things I want to remind everybody of, that progress is so incrementally slow, and that just because nothing's happening now doesn't mean that you're not planting the seeds of something happening later. And just keep pushing, keep working, keep ranting, keep being noisy, because the more of us that are noisy, the more of us that are pushing, the further we're going to get. And every tiny little bit, even if it's just a tweet, even if it's a Facebook post, a picture on Instagram, a hashtag, it doesn't matter. All of it counts. All of it adds up, and every voice is welcome and valid.
Amazing. Nicole, thank you very much. You've been listening to Have the Nerve, a podcast by Spinal Cord Injuries Australia. Please check the show notes for resources to support if you or someone you know is in a similar situation. This episode has been written, produced and edited by me, Susan Wood, and logo art by Kobe Ann Moore. If you like our show, please consider sharing this episode with someone you know, and if you're listening to us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, please consider giving us a 5-star review. You can find SCIA on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn and Twitter. Thank you for listening.